Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is up there for me as one of my favorite franchises, with 6 amazing graphic novels, a kick-ass video game, and a cult classic movie respectively. So when it was announced that Netflix was producing an anime based on the comics with Brian Lee O'Malley and Edgar Wright at the helm, plus the cast of the movie reprising their roles, and the music by Anna Monoguchi, I was over the moon to see a one-to-one animated adaptation of one of my favorite series free from the limitations of its live-action counterpart. Except that's not what we got, but that doesn't mean what we got was bad. Before I get into the show, let me give a bit of background in case you're a newcomer to the franchise. Scott Pilgrim is a series of graphic novels created by Canadian comic book artist Brian Lee O'Malley, with the first book, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, releasing back in 2004. The main character gets his name from the song Scott Pilgrim by the band Plume Tree. The series is a great twist on the classic boy meets girl story, with Scott having to fight each of Ramona's 7 evil exes in order to win the right to date her. The series garnered a huge following, leading to a live-action movie directed by Edgar Wright, being released in 2010 with about as perfect of a cast as you can get. The movie was a hit with critics and fans alike, but somehow did poorly in theaters, but it was a huge financial success once it was released on DVD and is regarded by many as a cult classic. To tie into the movie's release, a video game was also created to release alongside the movie. Scott Pilgrim vs. the Game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up with up to 4 players and is yet another retelling of the same story with a kick-ass soundtrack by Anna Monoguchi that you're probably going to be hearing throughout this video. Now with that out of the way, I'm going to do my best to explain why Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a worthy addition to the franchise despite what the critics might be saying. Spoilers for the show, obviously. Episode 1 starts off almost exactly like the comic does, with a few events slightly updated and some new jokes slid in where appropriate, like Ramona now delivering DVDs for Netflix, which was a huge shot of nostalgia for me. Scott is introduced like normal, he's dating Knives, he's in a band, meets the girl of his dreams, and has to fight her 7 evil exes just like in the graphic novels, game, and the movie, and just like in all the other versions of the story, he dies. What? Yeah, it was at this point that I realized that this wasn't just going to be another retelling of the classic boy meets girl story that we've grown accustomed to. And that's okay. We already have 2 faithful adaptations in both the movie and the game, so while I was admittedly a bit disappointed when this happened, I was also excited to see what direction this new story was going to go in. And in yet another welcome twist, the series frames Ramona Flowers as the protagonist going forward as she sets out to find out what happened to Scott after realizing he's still alive. I've seen people complaining that this was a horrible decision because you can't have a Scott Pilgrim show without the title character, and I couldn't disagree more. We've already had 2 versions of this story already, 3 if you count the game, giving us more than enough time to get to know Scott as a character. So removing Scott for a time is actually a brilliant move, since it allows Ramona to confront her exes on her own as she searches for answers. And it's just great seeing her confront her past instead of Scott doing it for her like before. And it allows for Ramona and each of all the 7 evil exes to be more fleshed out as actual characters, especially since both the viewer and Ramona realize along the way that she hurt each of the exes differently. Okay, maybe except for Gideon. Hell, Lucas Lee literally says that Ramona breaking his heart turned him into who he is today.
That was the day I decided who I was going to be. The best skater, the highest paid actor, the biggest star. That day made me who I am. So I guess, in a way, I have to thank you, Ramona.
She also buries the hatchet with Roxy Richter and apologizes for leaving her the way she did. Gideon Graves gets a whole subplot after Matthew Patel beats him and takes over his media empire. Yeah, you heard that right. They made Matthew Patel, the first boss, an actual awesome character. Todd Ingram gets a whole love triangle with Wallace and Envy Adams, and the twins are there. Yeah, that's kind of one thing the adaptations never got right, is that the twins are always just in the background. It happened in the movie, and it happened here too, but at least they have speaking roles this time. It's honestly just great to see these characters interacting with each other like real people instead of the exes just being boss characters for Scott to beat. I mean, it was fun the first 3 times, but 4 is kind of pushing it, you know? The members of Sex Bob-omb are also fleshed out with a lot of great moments, with young Neil being my personal favorite.
A little blurry. My mom says I should get my eyes checked.
Knives kinda does suffer though from the new direction, because she goes from being mad at Ramona to just making music with Steven Stills in the band, but by the end of the show she's grown as a person and realizes that Scott dying was actually a good thing for her. Now, in order for me to really nail what makes this show great, I have to get into heavy spoilers about the last couple of episodes, so, be warned. The thing is, we know Scott as a character, since he's been the protagonist of every adaptation so far, so giving the supporting cast their time to shine is just an awesome move on the show's part. But where's Scott been the whole time, and who kidnapped him and why? Well, in classic Scott Pilgrim fashion, he is his own worst enemy. Literally, Scott was taken to the future by a future version of himself at the age of 37. He brings Scott to the future to get him away from Ramona, saying that dating and then later marrying her was the worst mistake of his life, and wants his younger self to stop trying to date her to save himself the pain. This was a really intriguing move to show that loving Ramona comes with a heavy price that Scott may not be willing to pay. Like I said earlier, in classic Scott Pilgrim fashion, he's his own worst enemy, since older Scott takes the narrative place of Nega Scott from the graphic novel, representing the worst parts of Scott's personality, showing that if he doesn't deal with his flaws, he'll become just another one of Ramona's evil exes. Having an older version of Scott be the big bad is a really great twist that still fits thematically.
Because there's only one way to end it. Me versus the world!
But I can't not mention this awesome fight scene with all the evil exes, Scott and Ramona, fighting old Scotty D. Like, oh my god, look at this animation. And having his version of Ramona Flowers show up to confront him is also a great move. It's such a serious scene with great jokes woven in though.
We hit one rough patch, and you go completely insane? Why are you in the past fighting all of these people?
And a robot.
When you could have been fighting for us.
Of course, an emotionally inept and insecure Scott would misconstrue Ramona wanting space as a breakup and do crazy things like try to alter his past through time travel. Then to top it all off, Ramona accepts all the negative aspects of herself to become Super Ramona.
Super Ramona! It's just like
Sonic
the Hedgehog 3!
I mean 3.
And sends older Scott back to the future to fix things with his Ramona, because it's never too late to clean up a mess. Scott and Ramona end up together, Gideon Graves gets his empire back, and Scott doesn't have to fight the exes. Yet. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a wonderful adaptation that puts a new spin on the classic Scott Pilgrim story. Funnily enough, the title of the show gives away the twist in hindsight, since Scott is absent for a majority of the 8-episode run. But it isn't a negative for the show, since with him gone, the rest of the cast gets some much needed time to shine. Speaking of the cast, all the actors reprising their roles do an amazing job stepping back into these characters. The show even fixes one of my biggest gripes about the movie being Ramona and Scott's chemistry. You see, in the movie, they didn't really come off like they actually loved each other, and that's probably because the movie had to condense 6 graphic novels in under 2 hours. But the show's slower approach, combined with the benefit of hindsight, really makes Scott and Ramona feel like they love each other, with genuinely good chemistry amplified by Michael Cera and Mary Elizabeth Winstead's performances. The story still comes to the same conclusion as every other adaptation: Scott and Ramona get together. Having the evil exes be fleshed out as characters will make it all the better when Scott inevitably has to fight them if the mid-credit scene is anything to go by. But who knows, it's Netflix we're talking about, so there may not be more episodes on the way. Anyway, let me know what you thought of this show in the comments below. I'm the Wildcard, and I'll see you next time. Peace.